I heard the crunch first. Rubber against gravel, followed by a screech and a honk. Then I saw the Range Rover barreling down my private driveway like it was the freeway. The driver, some teenager in a varsity jacket, stared at me like I was in the way. He didn't slow down. Just zipped past my garage, skirted around my dog, and exited onto the next street through a makeshift gate I definitely didn't install. 30 seconds later, another car followed. Then another. And just like that, my peaceful, dead-end driveway, on private land I paid dearly for, had somehow become the HOA's new shortcut. That's when I realized this wasn't an accident. This was invasion. And they weren't done. 3 days earlier, things had been quiet. My wife and I bought this place on a corner plot specifically because of the long, curved driveway that let us avoid the clutter of the main neighborhood road. I work from home as an industrial engineer, and peace is kind of my whole thing. But that week, I noticed more tire marks than usual near my hedges. At first, I assumed it was just the mail carrier turning around or maybe the neighbor's kid learning to drive. No big deal. But on the third day, I found a paper sign nailed to a wooden stake near the edge of my lawn. It said, "Community Flow Access, Temporary Routing, Approved by HOA." Now, I'm not stupid. I know how HOA types operate. I've watched them argue for 15 minutes over mailbox paint. But I never thought they'd be bold enough to literally redirect traffic through private property. Still, I tried to assume it was just a misunderstanding. I took the sign, walked down to the HOA office, conveniently located in a converted model home, and asked to speak with whoever was responsible. That's when I met Karen. Yes, her real name. Yes, she lived up to it. Karen had the posture of someone who'd never been wrong and the voice of someone who narrated perfume commercials, until you disagreed with her. Then it became full-court press sarcasm. She smiled at me like I was a lost toddler and said, "Oh, yes, we just needed a temporary flow solution for the construction project on Maple Drive. It's only for a few weeks. Your property is just so accessible." I told her she had no legal right to use my land as a throughway. Her smile widened and she tapped her iPad. Actually, it's adjacent to the community boundary. Technically, that makes it a soft access zone if approved by the board. I asked her to show me this soft access zone clause in any law, code, or agreement. She said she'd be happy to in next month's meeting, which was after they'd already planned to finish repaving the Maple Drive intersection. I walked back home thinking maybe I should calm down, maybe just put up a gate. But the next morning, I saw the temporary gate had already been installed by HOA contractors. They'd pulled out one of my bushes, laid down a layer of cheap gravel across the side of my yard, and installed traffic cones with reflective tape. Someone even had the gall to install a painted wooden sign that said, "Exit only, please drive slow," on my land. That night, I called my cousin Barry. Barry's a lawyer. Not the suit and tie, fancy courtroom kind. He's the barefoot at barbecues, law library in his garage kind. But he's lethal with property law. I told him what was going on and he said, "Take pictures. Document everything. Don't touch the gate yet. Let them think they're winning." I asked him what I should do in the meantime. He said, "Let him drive. We'll make him pay for every inch." The next day, things escalated. I was sipping coffee on the porch when a literal tour of cars rolled through, 7 SUVs, all turning down my driveway like it was part of Google Maps. One of them honked when my trash bin was in the way. Another waved at me like I was the damn doorman. The final straw came when a mom in a minivan actually stopped to ask me if I could move my mailbox to make it easier for her to swing wide. That evening, I caught my neighbor Mitch standing awkwardly near the hedges. Mitch is a decent guy, the type who volunteers for HOA cleanup but also sneaks off to fish during board meetings. He looked guilty. Real guilty. I asked what was going on. He lowered his voice and said, "Look, man. I didn't want to say anything. But Karen's planning to push this permanent. She's getting the HOA to petition the county to recognize the drive as an easement. She's calling it an unofficial emergency route. They're gonna try to absorb your driveway into the official neighborhood map. I stared at him, stunned. He rubbed the back of his neck and added, "She's already got 2 signatures. She just needs 3 more." That night, I stood out by the edge of the driveway with a beer in one hand and my dog Max beside me, thinking, they're trying to steal my land. Not metaphorically. Literally. I paid for this plot. I paid for this driveway. And now Karen and her minions were trying to annex it with community road signs, forged signatures, and traffic cones. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I'd just take it. What they didn't know was that I used to design mechanical deterrent systems for logistics facilities. You know, stuff that stops forklifts from entering off-limits areas. Steel spikes, tire shredders, remote access gates, that kind of thing. I smiled, took a long sip, and whispered to Max, "All right, buddy. Time to play hardball." Because if Karen wanted to turn my driveway into a road, she was about to learn just how unwelcoming roads could get. I didn't even get the chance to launch my counterstrike before the HOA doubled down like a gambler on a losing streak. The next morning, I was brushing my teeth when Max started barking like someone had walked in wearing a raccoon costume. I looked out the bathroom window and nearly choked on my mouthwash. There, in my backyard, were 4 guys in neon vests with "Community Grounds Crew" printed on their backs, sawing through the wooden fence that separated my property from the greenbelt. Not trimming, not repairing, sawing. With power tools. I threw on a pair of sweats, sprinted outside barefoot, and shouted something between a war cry and a demand for explanation. One of them waved casually and said, "Karen approved this. We're creating alternate access from the park trail to maintain flow." Flow. That cursed word again. What the hell did flow mean to these people? This wasn't a yoga studio. This was my yard. I asked him if he had a permit. He said, "We don't need one. It's community land adjacent." I pointed at my fence, which clearly extended onto my deeded property. He shrugged and said, "Talk to Karen." Then they packed up and left, leaving a 5-foot-wide hole in my fence like a doggy door for SUVs. I'd had enough. I called the police to report trespassing and property damage. The officer was polite but hesitant. When I explained it involved the HOA, he sighed and asked if I had proof of ownership of the land. I said yes, and I had the plat map, the deed, and satellite images if he wanted them laminated. He chuckled but said it was more of a civil issue unless I could prove criminal intent. I asked if dismantling a fence with power tools didn't count as intent. He said that was up to interpretation, whatever that meant. So that evening, I decided to show up at the HOA's emergency town hall meeting, which had apparently been called to discuss community access optimization. It was held in the local clubhouse, a glorified double-wide with folding chairs and a snack table full of stale cookies. I walked in holding a giant poster board of my property lines and a USB stick full of surveillance footage. Karen, perched on the head table like a smug queen at a banquet, looked over her glasses and smiled. "Oh, you're here. Wonderful. We were just talking about you." No one ever says that in a good way. I introduced myself, said I had concerns about unauthorized construction and traffic being rerouted through private property, and asked who had authorized the breach in my fence. Karen tapped her tablet, then gave me a practiced look of concern. "That was a miscommunication," she said. "The crew believed it was Greenbelt territory. We'll review the boundaries later." I said I had the boundaries with me, right now, and could pull up the city assessor's map on the projector. She declined. Then she pivoted. "But the real issue is that your driveway is now a key exit point for the neighborhood. It would be irresponsible to remove that access during our construction phase. Safety comes first." I asked whose safety she was talking about, because so far the only one at risk was Max, who nearly got run over by a Jeep trying to merge into my backyard. A few neighbors chuckled. Karen did not. Then she made her big move. She clicked her iPad, and suddenly the screen behind her flashed with a PowerPoint slide titled Temporary Easement Proposal, Parcel 74B. That's my parcel. Below it were bullet points, all in Comic Sans, outlining a plan to temporarily designate my driveway as an emergency access lane, under HOA management. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I shouted over her and said that Parcel 74B was privately owned, and that any designation would require county approval, legal consent, and probably a blood sacrifice. She sighed and said, "We'll let the board vote on the proposal." I looked at the board members, 5 people who had either never spoken to me or once fined me for putting out recycling too early. One of them was already nodding like a bobblehead. The vote was 3-2 in favor. Karen grinned. Proposal passed. It's non-binding for now, but it gives us operational flexibility. Operational flexibility. I wanted to throw a chair. As I left the meeting, Barry called. He'd been watching via the Clubhouse livestream, because of course Karen had insisted on recording it for transparency. He said, "She just shot herself in the foot." I asked how. He said, "She introduced a legal proposal based on false claims and voted it into the record. That means she's responsible for any consequences. And if you record her confirming her knowledge of the falsehood, well, then we've got something juicy." I got home and found a letter taped to my garage door. It was from Karen, of course. It read, "Dear homeowner, we are excited to announce the pilot phase of community flow routing is underway. Please remove any personal obstructions from the driveway to allow smooth passage. Thank you for being part of a better tomorrow." There was a smiley face sticker in the corner. I sat on the porch with Max again, watching yet another car roll through and nearly clip my garden hose. I thought about how absurd this had gotten. My driveway had gone from a private amenity to a public highway in less than a week, with Karen waving her digital wand and calling it progress. The funny part? She thought I was still playing defense. What she didn't know was that I'd already submitted a cease and desist letter through Barry, filed a preliminary injunction request with the city, and requested a zoning clarification from the county. I had also placed hidden trail cams at 3 access points, all recording every plate and timestamp of every car using my land. And best of all, I'd started designing my masterpiece. See, back in my logistics days, I worked on deterrence for theft-prone loading zone. One of our more experimental projects was a motorized spike strip system, steel spikes that could be raised or lowered remotely, controlled via a sensor or even voice command. Technically illegal for public roads, but on private property? Totally fair game. The materials had already been ordered. Industrial gravel, customized retractable spikes, a little solar panel for power. I was going to turn my driveway into the worst detour anyone had ever taken. Let them come. Let them flow. There's something oddly therapeutic about planning revenge when it's fully legal and completely deserved, especially when it involves power tools, steel, and a level of petty precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. That night, I stayed up sketching blueprints like a mad scientist in a garage workshop thriller. By morning, I had the full schematic laid out for what I was now proudly calling Operation Gravel Gladiator. The plan was simple in concept, brilliant in execution. I was going to transform my smooth, HOA-invaded driveway into a mechanical gauntlet of pure, car-hating defiance. First, I ordered a fresh load of industrial-grade gravel, not the landscaping pebbles you'd find at a garden center. No, this stuff was sharp-edged, road-roughening, undercarriage-scratching gravel used on off-grid logging trails. I told the supplier I needed it dumped precisely on the middle stretch of my driveway. When the truck arrived, the driver looked confused. "You sure you want this here? Looks like you still use this driveway." I nodded and grinned. Not anymore. Next came the fun part. The spike strip system. Years ago, I had worked on an early design for a retractable deterrent mechanism for restricted freight access. That prototype never made it to market, mostly because legal departments and insurance companies have no imagination. But I'd kept the blueprints. With a few tweaks and some time in the garage, I created a motorized spike system that could be manually raised or lowered via a Bluetooth remote or even a simple garage door button. It ran off a battery and solar panel combo. I installed it under a removable metal plate disguised with gravel, set right in the tire path of where these HOA-possessed drivers were cutting through. I tested it with my own car first, raised the spikes, approached slowly, then lowered them just in time to pass safely. Then I tried it with the spikes up. My tires hissed and deflated within 2 seconds. Effective. Deadly. Perfect. By noon the next day, everything was in place. The new gravel had turned the previously smooth concrete into a miserable rattling hellscape. The hidden spike strip, primed and waiting, was carefully covered with just enough dirt and rock to blend in. And the icing on the cake, I posted a shiny new sign at the driveway entrance. Nothing aggressive, just a simple, understated message that read, "Private property, no through traffic, proceed at your own risk." Apparently, the HOA had taught their followers to ignore all signage unless it had the word community on it. Because within 20 minutes of my setup being complete, the first victim arrived. A white Mercedes SUV driven by none other than Karen herself. I stood in the shadows near my porch, sipping an iced tea, watching with the satisfaction of a man about to win bingo with all 4 corners. She turned into my driveway without hesitation, just as 3 other cars lined up behind her, waiting to follow through like it was the morning commute. Karen didn't notice the new gravel. Or if she did, she probably thought it was a design choice, maybe something she could find me for later. Her SUV coasted confidently toward the middle of the driveway, right over the spike plate. I clicked the button in my pocket. It was like something out of an action movie. The spikes shot up with a hiss of compressed air and metal. Her front tires hit them squarely. There was a crunch followed by an almost comical pffft. The Mercedes lurched forward like a wounded animal, grinding its rims into the sharp gravel before coming to a full, humiliating stop. She opened the door in disbelief and stepped out in high heels, trying not to wobble. I watched her stare at her tires, trying to process how her perfectly manicured world had just met a fortress disguised as a driveway. Behind her, the other cars started honking. One of them backed out in panic. Another driver stepped out and asked if she needed help. She waved him off, absolutely fuming. Then she turned, saw me standing there with Max by my side, and shouted, "You sabotaged the road." I smiled. "Driveway. Private. Not a road." She pointed a shaking finger at the ground. "There are spikes in there." "Sure are," I said calmly. "It's a deterrent. Just for uninvited guests. You'll be hearing from the HOA. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Again. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding immediate removal of dangerous installations and accusing me of endangering community members. I replied with a letter of my own, on Barry's official letterhead, highlighting the repeated trespasses, destruction of property, and recorded proof that all traffic was warned via signage. We included a still frame from my security camera clearly showing her ignoring the sign and speeding onto my land. But that wasn't the end of it. That afternoon, the HOA called for another emergency board meeting. Barry and I both attended. This time, Barry wore his best Hawaiian shirt just to irritate them. Karen was waiting, bandaged and still seething, with photos of her flat tires printed out and mounted like they were pieces of a crime scene. She declared me a danger to the community and demanded I be fined the maximum penalty for sabotaging shared access infrastructure. Barry stood up and calmly handed out copies of the actual property deed to each board member. He pointed to the official parcel boundary. "What shared infrastructure? This man owns every inch of that driveway. It's not part of any community plan, nor was it ever approved for communal use. In fact, your attempt to vote on using it as such was made using fraudulent information." Karen stammered. It was a misunderstanding." "No," Barry said, stepping forward. "It was trespassing. It was willful negligence. It was a campaign of harassment. And this document right here. He held up a time-stamped screenshot of Karen's HOA memo describing the rerouting plan, regardless of homeowner resistance, proves it. The room went dead silent. One of the board members, a guy named Allen who looked like he had been dragged into the HOA against his will, muttered, "Wait, are we liable for this?" Barry grinned. "Oh, you bet." The meeting ended without resolution. Karen stormed out, heels clicking like gunshots, while the rest of the board suddenly discovered reasons to re-evaluate the easement discussion. That night, the shortcut traffic disappeared like rats abandoning a sinking ship. My driveway was finally quiet again. But I knew it wasn't over. Karen wouldn't give up that easily. Still, as I sat on the porch with Max, watching the wind rustle the trees and the last rays of sunlight hit the sharp gravel like tiny diamonds, I couldn't help but laugh. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission. They thought they could outvote me, outmaneuver me, and wear me down. They didn't know who they were messing with. They weren't up against a stubborn homeowner. They were up against an engineer with blueprints, a lawyer cousin, and absolutely nothing left to lose. By the end of the week, the HOA had gone disturbingly quiet. No letters, no emails, no HOA drones on segways rolling by to take photos of my non-compliant gravel aesthetic. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. I knew Karen well enough by now to understand that silence didn't mean surrender. It meant scheming. That woman would go to war over a misaligned lawn gnome. There was no way she was letting the spike strip incident go. And I was right. Because 2 days later, I got a visit from the county inspector. He arrived unannounced in a city-issued sedan, stepped out wearing reflective sunglasses and a clipboard that looked like it had citations ready to rain from the heavens. I was in the garage installing a wireless backup for the spike system when he called out, "You the property owner?" I stood up, wiped my hands and said, "That depends on who's asking. If it's the IRS, I'm just the guy watering the grass." He cracked a smile. "Nah, I'm county. Got a report about unauthorized land modifications, obstruction of emergency access, and installing military-grade vehicle deterrents on a public easement." He looked amused more than concerned. I motioned for him to follow me around the side yard, past Max, who gave him a half-hearted woof, then up to the driveway. He looked at the gravel, then squatted to inspect the spike plate. "You build this?" he asked. I nodded. "Every inch." He whistled. "Looks like something I saw at a shipping yard in Oakland. Not bad." He stood up, brushing gravel off his knee. "Mind if I take a look at your paperwork?" I brought him inside and handed over a folder containing my property deed, surveyor maps, Barry's cease and desist letters, and the HOA's recorded proposal from the town hall meeting. He flipped through them slowly, nodding every so often. When he got to the screenshot of Karen's memo describing my driveway as a provisional secondary exit, he let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, that's gonna be a problem for them." I asked if I was in trouble. He shook his head. "Not even a little. The land's yours. The driveway's yours. They have no authority to modify, designate, or use it without consent. And that spike strip? Technically aggressive, sure, but still legal on private property. You posted signage too. That's more than most people do." Then he added, almost with relish, "And just between us, I've had to deal with your HOA before. Karen and I go way back." That got my attention. I asked what happened. He leaned against the kitchen counter like he was settling in for a story. "A few years ago, she tried to rezone a neighbor's lot to build a community meditation gazebo. Problem was, she didn't get the neighbor's permission. Same story. Claimed it was adjacent land, tried to push it through the board, filed a temporary designation with our office without real documentation. We flagged it, shut it down, and fined the HOA for false filings. She's been on my radar ever since." I almost offered the man a beer. Before he left, He said he'd file a full report affirming that the HOA had violated several zoning ordinances and overstepped their legal boundaries. He also hinted that the county might audit their past petitions if similar complaints came up again. I thanked him, and as he got into his car, he said, "Keep the spike strip. Just maybe don't electrify it." I smiled. No promises. As satisfying as that visit was, the cherry on top came later that evening. I had been reviewing some security footage from the driveway cam when I noticed something odd. A group of HOA workers had come by 2 nights earlier, just past midnight. They were dressed in dark clothing, no vests, no logos, clearly trying not to be seen. They snuck along the hedges, used bolt cutters to snip the caution tape I'd put up after Karen's tire fiasco, and proceeded to tamper with the gate lock at the rear access point. One of them even took pictures of my garage keypad. I zoomed in on his face. It was Todd, Karen's weaselly nephew, who just happened to be the HOA's technical coordinator. This was no longer annoying. This was illegal. I forwarded the footage to Barry, who immediately lit up like a Christmas tree. "We've got them," he said. "That's trespassing, attempted unlawful entry, and probable intent to commit theft or vandalism. And since they acted on behalf of the HOA, she's on the hook." Barry suggested we play it smart. Instead of confronting Karen, we'd present the footage during the next open HOA board meeting in front of residents. Let the community see the rot for themselves. But before we could do that, I made one final move. Months ago, when I first bought the house, I'd noticed a small plot of unused land behind my fence. It was technically outside my parcel but completely neglected. A strange little triangle of overgrown weeds and trash. When I checked the public land records, I found that the plot had reverted to the county after the original developer abandoned it. It was up for public auction dirt cheap. So I bought it. Quietly. Legally. Entirely mine. Karen had no idea. She'd been using that triangle of land as part of her flow corridor. Her whole plan depended on claiming that triangle as communal greenbelt, even though she'd never filed the paperwork to annex it. And now, with the paperwork finalized, I owned the very ground she had based her shortcut ambitions on. I printed the deed and framed it. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the room was buzzing. The spike strip incident had become neighborhood legend. I could see Karen trying to keep control, speaking in overly calm tones while sweat glistened at her temples. Barry and I arrived late on purpose. When Karen asked if we had anything to contribute to community infrastructure improvements, Barry stood up, connected his laptop to the projector, and played the night vision footage of Todd and the Midnight Crew. There was a collective gasp, followed by murmurs of, "Is that Todd? And is that our money paying for this?" Then I stepped forward and handed Karen an envelope. She opened it, expecting a complaint. Instead, she found the deed to the triangle lot. Her face froze. I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Just so we're clear, this land is no longer HOA adjacent. It's mine. I own the triangle, which means your shortcut is officially closed." Karen stared at the paper like it had personally betrayed her. One of the board members stood up and said, "I move for a review of Karen's actions regarding land use, legal filings, and unauthorized spending." Another member added, seconded. The vote passed unanimously. As I left the meeting, Max waiting in the truck, I felt the kind of peace only mechanical revenge, county validation, and surprise land purchases can bring. Karen wasn't done fighting, but she was bleeding influence. Her plan had failed. The shortcut was dead. And the spikes? Oh, they weren't going anywhere. 2 weeks after the showdown at the HOA meeting, everything in the neighborhood felt different. Not quieter. Karen wasn't capable of silence, but more uncertain. The spike strip incident had gone from whispered gossip to full-on legend. I overheard a couple of teenagers biking past my house refer to the driveway as the death strip, and someone even left a drawing in my mailbox of a cartoon tire crying as it rolled over spikes. Barry framed it and hung it in his office. But underneath the humor you could feel the shift. The spell had broken. Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping, and for the first time, the board seemed less like a private army and more like a bunch of people desperate to avoid lawsuit. But I knew better than to get too comfortable. Karen wasn't the kind of person to fade quietly into irrelevance. She was a storm in heels, and she was saving her biggest stunt for last. It came in the form of an emergency safety ordinance proposal slipped into the HOA's monthly newsletter, written in overly sanitized language that danced around legality. The ordinance, in theory, would allow the HOA to enforce temporary access rights during emergencies, including natural disasters, construction, or events deemed disruptive to community flow. In other words, it was Karen's backdoor attempt to reclaim access to my property anytime she could stretch the definition of inconvenience. The boldest part? She included a map of the neighborhood in the newsletter, and my driveway was highlighted as a designated emergency exit. Again, the arrogance of it was astonishing, but it also gave me everything I needed. I printed out the newsletter, highlighted the offending parts, and marched down to the county office with Barry in tow. We met with the same inspector who had visited weeks earlier, John, a guy who now smiled every time I walked in like I brought popcorn. When we showed him the revised map and ordinance proposal, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. "She's either got guts or no sense of self-preservation," he said. "This is a zoning violation waiting to happen." Barry laid it out clean. Karen was proposing an ordinance that created implied easements over private land without legal authority, consent, or compensation. Worse, she was distributing these materials as official HOA communications, implying county support where there was none. John nodded slowly, then said, "Yeah, I think it's time we have a little sit-down, with the entire board." And that's how we found ourselves at the most chaotic HOA meeting in neighborhood history. It was held in the clubhouse again, but this time there were so many residents in attendance that they had to bring in folding chairs from the pool area. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, buzzing with curiosity. Karen arrived dressed like she was giving a TED Talk, wearing a blazer with shoulder pads sharp enough to slice bread and that Bluetooth earpiece she always forgot wasn't plugged in. She smiled, waved, and took the podium like a general addressing her troops. She opened with a speech about safety, unity, and the responsibility we all share to think ahead. Then she unveiled a massive banner titled "Pathways to Community Harmony," featuring a giant aerial view of the neighborhood, with my driveway front and center, colored bright green. That was when John stood up from the back, raised his hand, and said, "I have a few questions." The room hushed. Karen blinked, her mouth forming a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Please." John walked to the front and faced the crowd. "I'm a county inspector, and what you see here is an illegal modification of public records. This map implies county endorsement. It has none. Furthermore, the so-called emergency ordinance you've distributed violates zoning regulations, property rights, and multiple sections of the Civil Code." Karen tried to interrupt, but he kept going. "We've also reviewed footage submitted by a resident showing unauthorized personnel tampering with private property at night. That footage has been turned over to law enforcement, and due to the pattern of behavior, we are now launching a formal audit of this HOA's governance practices." You could have heard a pin drop. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. One board member pushed back from the table and stood. "I vote for a motion of no confidence in President Karen's leadership." Another stood up. "Seconded." A third said, "All in favor?" Nearly every hand went up. Karen stood frozen, mouth opening and closing like a fish trying to explain tax fraud. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, the door opened and a tow truck driver leaned in holding a clipboard. "Hey, is Karen here? Got an order to repossess a vehicle registered to the HOA, something about misuse of community funds." She turned the color of overcooked shrimp and bolted out of the room. The clubhouse erupted in laughter and applause. The fallout was immediate. Karen resigned from the HOA the next morning via a passive-aggressive email filled with barely disguised threats and an invitation to look forward to my upcoming memoir. The HOA board initiated a full review of every policy she'd pushed through in the past year, and several were quietly reversed. As for me, I received a formal apology from the board, along with a statement acknowledging my full rights to deny any access through my property moving forward. Barry had it notarized and framed. A few days later, I decided to throw a little celebration. Nothing big, just a neighborhood barbecue at the end of my gravel driveway, with a custom banner that read, "Shortcut closed, party open." I grilled burgers, played music, and unveiled a special surprise. Mounted on a post at the driveway's entrance was a small plaque that read, "Private property violators will be spiked, shamed, and possibly federal." Neighbors came by, some shy at first, but once they realized Karen was officially dethroned, they relaxed. Mitch brought beer. The couple down the street brought their corgi in a tuxedo. Even John from the county dropped by to grab a hot dog and compliment the spike system, now raised in trophy mode. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last guests waved goodbye, I sat on the porch with Max. The stars were out, the air was cool, and the gravel gleamed in the moonlight like a silent guardian. The shortcut was gone. The chaos had passed. And Karen? She was just a footnote in a story too absurd to be fiction. Max looked up at me, then out at the driveway, and let out one long, satisfied sigh. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy. We earned this."